Okay, good afternoon and happy September. Welcome to this very important and timely webinar on special education for pediatricians. This afternoon we have with us Dr. Wendy Ross, Mr. Josh Kirschenbaum, Esquire, and Maria Vetter, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them. Dr. Wendy Ross is the Director of the Center for Pediatric Development and founder of Autism Inclusion Resources. She is board certified in general pediatrics and developmental and behavioral pediatrics. Dr. Ross attended the Humanities and Medicine program at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York before completing a pediatrics residency at Yale and a developmental and behavioral pediatrics fellowship at Children's Hospital Boston. She remained on faculty as an attending at Children's Hospital Boston and an instructor at Harvard Medical School before moving to Philadelphia in 2006. Mr. Josh Kirschenbaum from Frankel & Kirschenbaum is a determined advocate for children and their families. Josh Kirschenbaum brings a unique combination of passion, intellect, and experience to his comprehensive education and family-focused practice. Josh's work on behalf of children with special needs and their families includes counseling and representation with respect to all forms of disputes over the provisions of education services, such as those arising under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, Section 504, and other federal and state statutes. Accordingly, Josh represents clients at IEP meetings and administrative due process hearings, in settlement negotiations with school districts, and in state and federal litigation. Josh's clients benefit not only from his extensive litigation experience, but from the valuable perspective and knowledge he gained in his previous career as a teacher in a public elementary school. And Mrs. Maria Vetter, also from Frankel & Kirschenbaum, is a versatile and devoted educational consultant and child advocate. Maria Vetter has dedicated her career to children and their educational needs. She possesses a wealth of experience working with children who are challenged by special needs with a primary focus on children who have autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's syndrome with language-based learning differences. Maria also has considerable expertise in addressing a wide range of other needs and disabilities. She is accomplished in developing programs to accommodate the needs of children in private, public, and parochial schools, camps, colleges, and home settings, including training staff as an advocate. Maria works with families of students with special needs from diagnosis and early intervention to school age and transitioning out of school into independent living. She helps families understand the educational process and aids them in securing specialized services that their children require. And now I'd like to turn the webinar over to our honored guest. Thank you very much.
Carol, thank you so much for the introduction. We are really excited to be here today. This is clearly a passion of ours, and as a developmental pediatrician, I see kids all the time with issues in school and have to advocate for them to get their needs met. And as a general pediatrician, I always try to take into account that kids spend the majority of their waking hours in school. And if you think about it, if it's 8 hours a day, 180 days a year, it's about 1,500 hours a year. And of all the kids that we see in our practices, you might be surprised to know that about 13% of students receive special education services. So in your practice, that's about 1 to every 10 to 15 kids is probably receiving some kind of special education. It's also important to remember that schools are responsible for educating students academically, but they're also responsible for meeting the social and emotional needs of students, which means that not only should the educational plan address academics, but even if a student is on target academically, but they have social and emotional needs alone, the school should be meeting those needs. This is a big deal, not just because of the amount of students that need special education and the amount of time that kids spend in school, but over half of the students in special education have faced or will face at some point disciplinary action in school. This could happen before they're identified. It could present just as a disciplinary issue, or it could happen afterwards. And it's important to understand that and to see their disciplinary needs in the spectrum of them as a person, and why, to understand the role that behavior serves for them.
Yeah, this is Maria Vetter. A lot of times students' behaviors will pop up and they are disciplined for those behaviors. When behavior is really a language, it's a way the child is communicating something, and very often we find that those behaviors manifest out of a disability that has been not diagnosed. And I have seen kids, or we have seen kids that end up with an emotional support designation, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit later, but basically saying they're presenting with an emotional disturbance or an emotional issue, when really that emotional issue was coming from an underlying special education or developmental need or academic need that was not programmed for appropriately for a long period of time.
Right. So it's really, to understand the impact of special education, kids spend a lot of time in school. Over 10% of them have special ed needs, and these needs can manifest as overt academic needs. They can be social needs. They can present as disciplinary issues, and they can take a huge toll on a child. It could be that a child is coming in with complaints of headaches or stomach aches when really there's no physical organic cause for those complaints, but they could be a way of the child avoiding school or class or coping with the stress of a learning problem. There is also a huge family impact of special education needs, and I think that's really important to understand. When a child needs help in school and their needs are not going to be met, this is really a problem of the whole family. And frequently I've seen in my practice that the children themselves as well as the parents are blamed for the issues that their children are facing. And it causes a lot of overall problems. So a lot of times parents will bring up an issue about school performance. Sometimes this will come up as a stomach ache in your practice, but it's really important if a parent does not bring it up that it's part of routine care that pediatricians are asking about school. And asking not only about the academic issues, but asking about social and emotional issues. So when you're seeing a child, if they're presenting with a physical complaint, or even if it's a well-child check, I think from my perspective, given the amount of time that kids spend in school and the amount of kids that do have special education needs, that it becomes routine to ask some questions around this issue.
And I would say that when you say 13% of kids are receiving special education services, the need is probably so much greater than that 13%.
Right, because there's probably kids that aren't identified.
Correct, yes.
Yeah, I would also, this is Josh, I would also guess that, this 13% is the general population. My guess is that of the kids that you see as a physician, it's probably a slightly higher percentage because of the things that Wendy was saying, in that a lot of times kids are having physical problems, physical symptoms as a result of issues that are going on in school, or as you might experience, you're getting a lot of phone calls or requests for absence excusal notes and things of that sort because the kid has been having difficulty getting himself to school.
So anxiety, avoidance.
It might actually be more common among the kids that you see than in the general population.
So I guess part of where we're going to steer this conversation is how do you ask about this? And Josh came up with this great mnemonic about ways of approaching these questions to children and families.
Yeah, so we came up with this, a little mnemonic device for pediatricians to think about whenever you have a client come into the office. We call it GLAD, G-L-A-D. You want to ask about grades, learning, attendance, attention, and discipline, meaning it's perfectly, not only just appropriate, it's really important as one of the normal questions that you're asking a kid or a parent during a visit. How is he doing in school? How is she doing in school? Have you noticed any changes in grades? Have the grades started to drop? Is he or she really anxious about their grades? Oftentimes, special education needs will become apparent when there's a drop in grades, when the kid is struggling academically.
And grades means more than just report cards. It can mean any of the standardized assessments, local assessments. Very often elementary and little kids don't really receive quote-unquote grades, but they can receive, consistent with, satisfactory, or things like that. So when you see any drop in those levels as well.
And because grades are a very imperfect and somewhat subjective measure, we encourage you to also ask general questions about learning. Is the student, struggling in any academic areas? Are they, they having trouble learning to read? Are they having trouble in math? Is there any subjects that are causing any problems? Again, the grades might be good, and it might require some probing, but again, students that are struggling, particularly older students that are still struggling to read or still struggling to master basic concepts might have an underlying learning disability that needs to be diagnosed. So asking about this is very important. Attendance and attention. Very frequently, there are students that have issues paying attention and getting to school on time. Sometimes that is a classic indicator that there might be an attention deficit issue going on, or some kind of an emotional issue that's happening. Kids that are frequently late for school or frequently missing school, and there's no obvious medical reason why that would be happening, it's very, very possible that they're avoiding something in school or they're stressed out about something that's going on in school. And similarly, attention. It's very important to ask about this, whether it's the parents or the kid, are they having difficulty focusing in class? Are they having difficulty getting their work done? And finally, discipline. It's important to ask, have there been any situations in school where a kid has been suspended or received detentions or is just getting in trouble a lot in school? Maybe it's getting sent to the principal's office a lot or being asked to sit out in the hallway, but we want to know whether any of that is happening.
I also just want to say one thing about attention. Just because a kid is inattentive, a lot of times teachers will start to sort of approach the issue of an attentional problem or perhaps a medication for attention. And it's true that some kids do have an attentional problem like ADHD, but attention is also a huge masquerader. It's also hard to pay attention to something that you're not understanding or that you're anxious about. So not all inattention is ADHD.
Right, and I guess just a little side note on that, it doesn't have to be ADHD for the kid to be eligible for help in school. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And finally, I guess I already mentioned discipline. And then the overall question, does the child seem happy? Are they happy going to school? Are they happy in general? Are they stressed out? Working this GLAD mnemonic into your regular intake and your regular conversations with your clients could make the difference between the kid getting help in school and not. Okay.
Right, so districts and schools and teachers all have child find requirements, and they're supposed to be spotting for issues with a child and whether or not they qualify for services. But, pediatricians also should be looking for those things. So how do you ask about a learning disability? We gave you that mnemonic for GLAD, and this is, you may not know or you may not recognize, and it's certainly not your area of expertise to diagnose, like if a student has dyslexia or if something academic is going on with them. But asking those questions and sort of understanding can help you point parents in the right direction of getting the help that they need. So how can you ask about an issue with social and emotional functioning? Same way, ask parents what's going on. Look for those red flags, even yellow flags, from parents about issues that are occurring in school.
Yeah, and I usually ask people in my practice, like, does your child have friends? Are they invited to things? And when I talk to the child, I'll ask them to name friends, because a lot of kids will say they have friends, but they're unable to name them, which is sort of an indicator that there's an issue.
And I feel like sometimes kids will say, I have friends because they talk to kids in school, but maybe they really, what's occurring outside of school is important too. Are they connecting with peers? Are they doing things outside of school with peers as well as in school? How are they functioning in group work, in academics, in the unstructured times, lunch and recess? Are they, ask the student, ask the parent, are you eating lunch by yourself? Are you by yourself? Like, are you playing at recess? What do you play? Who do you play with? These are all really simple, basic questions, but will give you a great deal of insight into what's happening during the student's day. And real quick, just about the learning disability, I think if you ask students about their classes and like what feels good about school, what doesn't feel good about school, also gives you a lot of insight. Like what feels hard for you, what feels easy for you. Kids understanding that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, but delving into that a little bit more to understand where are their weaknesses and is it just a relative weakness or is there possibility of a disability?
Yeah, and so if you ask these questions and you have this conversation with your client and their parents and you suspect that there is an issue, what do? Well, one of the first things to do, I think, is to talk to the parent and ask if they have any concerns or have any thoughts that there might be some challenges going on in school, and ask them what, if they, oftentimes parents do know this, they're aware of the fact that the child is struggling in school, and you can ask them what, have they in fact talked with the school district about this? Many times parents have not. If you suspect that you have a kid that is having issues in school and you talk to the parents and they don't seem to know what to do or they don't have any sort of a plan, I think it's a very good idea to encourage the clients to request an evaluation from their school district. Parents have the right to request a free evaluation at the district's expense. They have the right to request that the district evaluate the student in all areas of suspected need. And the district is required to do that evaluation. So this request needs to be done in writing. It can be done by email. It can be done with the parent just emailing the principal of the school or anybody in the school and saying, I am requesting that my child be evaluated for eligibility for special education services. That's all they have to do. And at that point, the district needs to provide the parents with a permission form. It's called a permission to evaluate form. And the district has to provide this to the parent within 10 days of the request. The parents would then sign the permission form and give it back, and then the district has 60 calendar days to complete an evaluation of the child. It's important to remember that in Pennsylvania, summer does not count in those 60 days. Meaning, if the parents request the evaluation in May and the 60th, and summer comes in before the 60 days is hit, the clock stops during the summer and it doesn't start back up again until the spring. So the sooner until the fall, until September. So the sooner that is requested, the better. And again, it should be done in writing. That's a free option for the parents. Now, if the parents don't trust the district or don't want to get it done through the district, parents can go out and get an independent evaluation. They can get evaluated by somebody outside of the district at their own expense, and parents may wish to do that. You can always refer people over to us, and we can give them the names of good people in the area who do evaluations. We know a lot of terrific people out there who do that kind of work. Okay. So we're going to jump in now to give you some understanding of the law. My goal here is not to make you into experts about this or to make you into lawyers, but just to give you a general idea of what's at issue here. My main objective here is really twofold. I want you to have a general sense of how powerful these laws are to be able to help students. I want you to also have an understanding of how complicated this can be and how overwhelmed parents can be by it.
And real quick, also, services, depending on districts, really vary. And some districts are very cooperative and very confident, and other districts really struggle in that area. So if you use your intuition, and parents need to use their intuition, if parents are asking for an evaluation and the district is saying no, that's a problem. And parents don't always know what their rights are, and so that's why educating you on their rights is important, because then you can help them in that area.
Right. And the other thing is that parents will often, and you guys as doctors know this really well, parents will often go on the internet to try to find information about this. And as with medicine, it's very dangerous, maybe slightly less dangerous than with medicine, for parents to go and try to educate themselves about the law here, because there's a lot of really bad information out there. So we want to give you a general sense of how this works so that you can be aware of when your clients may need support.
And we also, and then future slides, have links that are appropriate to you.
Right. So the first thing to note here is we're dealing with a combination of federal and state laws. The main laws that we're dealing with here are two federal laws. One is called the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA, or IDEA, and the second is called Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or Section 504. Those are two federal laws that apply all over the country. So they're going to apply to all the kids in public schools here in Pennsylvania as well. There are also two state laws that come into play here that are part of the Education Code, and they are called Chapter 14 and Chapter 16. I put in Chapter 16, that's the gifted statute. We're not going to talk a whole lot about that in this presentation, but I just wanted you to be aware that in Pennsylvania, gifted education is a requirement for kids who are eligible. Okay, so what are we dealing with here? So the two federal laws that we're talking about, IDEA and Section 504, they are very similar in some ways and extremely different in others, and they are often completely mixed up with each other, and parents don't have any clue what the difference is between them. The important thing for you to know and for you to remember is that IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, that's the one that gives the most protections. That's the one that gives kids IEPs. That's the one that we would like to have students protected under, if at all possible. And we will talk about what an IEP is in a moment. I gave you some links here in this slide. If you would ever like to look things up yourself in the law, or you'd like to give your clients a link, these links here to the laws are reliable links to the actual official regulations. You have to be really careful about Googling this, because you could pop up, you could try to be finding a regulation, and you go onto Google and you click on some link and it's an old version of the regulations. These ones here are reliable, they're kept up to date, and you can actually use them. I'm not necessarily recommending that you read these cover to cover, but if you ever wanted to look, that's where you would look. Another quick thing to understand here, and that's often a source of confusion, is that we want kids to be eligible for protection, and we will talk about why. We want kids to be eligible for protection under IDEA. A lot of kids will be eligible under one of these statutes, but maybe not the other. Just because you're eligible for one doesn't necessarily mean you're eligible under the other. Specifically, it's possible that a kid might be eligible for protection under Section 504, which is the weaker of the two, but not eligible for protection under the IDEA. It turns out that if you are eligible for protection under the stronger one, you are by definition eligible under the other one too. So I tell you this because a lot of parents get these two laws mixed up, and they think if their kid has a Section 504 plan that they're protected the same way as if they have an IEP, and they're not. So that's takeaway number one here is you want to know if the kid actually has protection under one of these two statutes already, and we'll talk about that as well. So here's the great thing about this law, this federal law IDEA. When a child is eligible for protection under it, they are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. A free and appropriate public education is a really very, very powerful right that kids have to education at no cost to the parents, that is appropriate, meaning it enables them to make progress in school and is individualized to the child's needs. And that word, individualization, is really the key to the whole thing. A child with IDEA eligibility is eligible for an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. It's literally a document that lays out the services and supports that the child will get, and it's sort of like a contract between the school and the family. That gives them the right to an individualized education to meet their unique needs. That is something that only kids that have IEPs have a right to. Kids that don't fall under the protection of these laws, they're not entitled to an individualized education. They're entitled to the general educational curriculum that everybody gets in the district. They don't have any rights to individualization. Kids who qualify under these laws do. So they're entitled to individualized special education and related services. Well, what does that mean? Well, special education is defined in the law as specially designed instruction. And what it means is they're entitled to actually tailored to the unique needs of that child, an education, whether it be in the home, in the classroom, in the hospital, or any other setting that they might be in, that is specially designed to their unique needs. Now, I'm going to just go back for a quick second. When a child is what determines whether a child is eligible for protection under the IDEA versus Section 504 is important to understand as well. What we're looking for here, first off, does the child have a disability? Now, you may be used to understanding that term disability from a medical standpoint, but it's a legal term as well. And so we need to know if the child does have a diagnosed disability, you give them a diagnosis as having some sort of a disability. If that disability limits them, it limits a major life function in some way, then they're considered a person with a disability, just like under Social Security. So if you've ever had to do any kind of a letter saying that somebody is disabled for the purposes of Social Security, that's the same exact standard that is used for protection under the weaker statute, Section 504. If a child has a disability, they are eligible for protection under Section 504, but unfortunately they're not provided with very much in the way of rights and protections under that statute.
So like an example of that could be like a child that has ADHD, but it does not need specially designed instruction, but maybe just needs some accommodations. They would be eligible for a 504 plan, not necessarily an IEP, but if it rose to the level that some students either have other issues above ADHD or their ADHD impacts their education severely and they do require an IEP.
Right. So the basic idea is that once the child is diagnosed with something, we can say they have legal rights in school that the parents need to know about. They need to have at least a Section 504 service agreement that says this is a person with a disability and they are entitled to have an education and not be discriminated against based on their disability. And but if the disability is such that it means that the child needs to have instruction delivered to them in a different way, specially designed instruction, meaning the child, say, has ADHD or the child has a learning disability or autism or any other disability, really. And as a result of that disability, they need to be taught in a different way. Otherwise, they can't really make progress. They can't really learn. If they have those two things together, the disability and the need for special changes to the way instruction is delivered, they're eligible for an IEP. They're eligible for protection under the better of the two laws, the IDEA. So what we want to be asking when we're delving into this is not only does this kid have a disability, but how is it affecting them in school? If it's affecting them in school in a way that requires them to be taught differently, to have one-on-one instruction, to have a smaller classroom setting, to have different kinds of assessments or different materials or different curriculum used to teach them.
And again, this is academically, but also socially and emotionally. It could be that a student academically is fine, but requires specially designed instruction in social skills areas or behavioral issues or coping strategies for emotional issues.
Right, so that's the big question is, do we need to change the way this kid is taught in order for them to make progress in school? And if the answer is yes, then they should be eligible for an IEP. They should be eligible for the protection under the stronger of the two laws. So as a doctor, what you're really trying to probe into is how is this disability impacting a kid in school? And if you feel that, clearly this kid's disability is interfering with their ability to learn in school, you should assume, just for the purposes of your conversation with them and in your mind, assume that they're eligible, that this kid should have an IEP. And you should ask the parents, do you know have you ever heard of an IEP before? Do you have one? Most parents might tell you, no, I haven't, I never heard of that before. If they've never heard of that before, that's a sure sign that they need to be referred to somebody who, an educational consultant or advocate or a special education lawyer or somebody that can advise them on their rights about this. If they have heard of it before, you could then ask, well, do they have one? And they might tell you, well, we tried to get one, but the school district said no. You should not assume that the district got that right. Very often, school districts will deny students an IEP, and they will give them a 504 service agreement instead. And they'll say that's all that they're eligible for. And the reason for that is that it's much easier for the district to comply with Section 504, and there's much fewer rights that the student has under that. So whenever possible, if they can get away with having them under the 504 instead of an IEP, they very much like to do that.
And I always try to think of like a 504 is like an equal access, like trying to level the playing field. But an IEP is really delivering special instruction in some area.
Right. The Section 504 plan, all that does is give, quote, accommodations. And accommodations are things like you get to sit in the front of the class or closer to the board. You get a little extra time for tests. You get to use, dictation software so that instead of typing because you can't type. There are things like you get to leave class a little bit early to get extra time to get to your next class.
If you're hearing impaired, if you're visually impaired, you get accommodations for those.
Right. You might get an amplification system or a magnification system. Those are accommodations. Mm-hmm. But if what the student needs is to be taught differently, that's something for an IEP. So, once it's determined that a student is eligible for an IEP through an evaluation or for a 504 plan, then the school district is supposed to work with the family to develop an appropriate placement for the student. In the case of a kid that has an IEP, that means sitting down and working together and developing that IEP. It needs to develop the supports and services that the student will receive, goals and objectives for the kid to meet, progress monitoring, all sorts of really, really powerful supports for this student. And it all gets written down into a document. The 504 service agreement is usually a little one-page thing that has a couple of things on it that says, like, the student can take an extra half an hour for tests. Very minimal. It's also possible that a student who's having behavioral problems in school, and what I mean by that is they're exhibiting behaviors that interfere with their learning or with other students' learning. It could be acting out in class. It could be tantruming. It could be all sorts of issues.
It could be school avoidance, like we talked about before, inattention, like
right.
All those
behaviors that are not every kid that has special needs has behaviors in school that are interfering with their learning, but some do.
A lot do, and then that's also when we said kids that are not identified can get into behavioral trouble, and that's how we sort of discover that something's going on with them. But the point of the school is really to identify what those behaviors are, what the antecedents are, what's going on with them, and put a positive plan in place so that the child is not punished. It shouldn't be punitive measures. It should be positive behavioral interventions that occur. And if you really treat the underlying issue, which is often some sort of disability, then the behavior sort of takes care of itself. But if there is a true behavioral issue, the school has to support that as well.
Yeah, and the big takeaway point there is the law actually requires that the district develop what's called a positive behavioral intervention plan or a positive behavioral support plan. If the kid is having these behaviors that are interfering with learning, you would want to ask the parents, has the school ever sat down with you to develop a positive behavioral support plan?
Or doing a behavior assessment.
Some kind of behavioral assessment. And if they look at you like they don't know what you're talking about, then 99 times out of 100, such a meeting never actually happened. And they didn't even know that they had the right one. Right. So what you'll often get is a kid who's acting out in school and just keeps getting suspended. That's not supposed to happen. They're supposed to work to develop a positive behavioral support plan to really reinforce, through positive means, reinforce good behavior. So a big red flag are kids that are exhibiting behaviors in school that are getting suspended or detained over and over and over again, but don't even have an IEP. They've never even been identified as having a kid as having special needs. I want to just jump, before we jump to that last slide, I want to just jump back to one quick thing that Maria alluded to earlier. Under the law, the responsibility for identifying kids who have eligibility for these, under these laws, falls 100% on the school district. It's not the kid's job to identify himself as having a disability. It's not the parent's job to bring it to the district's attention. It's not the doctor's job to bring it to the district's attention legally. It's 100% the district's responsibility. It's called child find. That's actually what it's called in the law, which means they literally have to find the children in the district who are eligible for these services. Unfortunately, though, as a practical matter, districts don't always fulfill their child find obligation, and they don't always identify the kids who need it. And so it falls upon the parents or the doctor, sometimes the student herself, to come forward and ask for that evaluation. So it's important, parents who you talk to, and they talk to us too, feel terribly guilty about the fact that their kid is suffering in school and that they themselves didn't do anything or they didn't do the right thing to get the kid the right help. And I think it's very important for you to reassure the parents that you work with that that by coming to you and by talking with you, they're doing the right thing, and that it's the school district's job, 100% the school district's job legally, to proactively go out and find these kids and help them. So if that didn't happen, it's the district's fault, not theirs, and that they can get help and we can help fix things. I just think it's important to mention that because that guilt, that shame even that parents come with is very real, and parents are sometimes embarrassed to say they never talked to the school about a problem or they never knew of such a thing. Right. And I think just being aware that parents may be coming from that place is important for you so you can assure them that they didn't do anything wrong. Okay, so jumping to this. Yeah. So these are 5 things that we tell all parents and all people that work with parents, 5 tips for good advocacy. Okay, the first thing is building the team, and this is sort of what we're doing right now. It's really, really important for parents to know that they have a team that's supporting them. They can't do this alone. Many, many parents, particularly parents of kids with special needs, become so used to doing everything on their own and to be the soldier that's fighting this fight by themselves. It is impossible to navigate this system appropriately on your own. You have to work with other people. Even I would bring Maria to an IEP meeting for my son if I had to go to one. I wouldn't want to go myself. So you want to help the families connect with other people for their team. Well, they've got you, that you're the doctor, but what about therapists to work with the kid or with the parents? What about an advocate? What about an attorney? What about other therapists or a tutor? Mm-hmm. You want to help them. If you don't know of folks who do this kind of work, just contact us. We can give you lots of names of good therapists, good advocates, good tutors, good everybody. Be organized. This is seriously important. There's a lot of paperwork that gets generated in these cases for parents that have tons of stuff. You want to ask them, where are they keeping all of their school records? Where are they keeping it? It's great to keep everything in like a binder, keep things in chronological order, and to write down, phone calls and communications. Not everybody's going to be able to be, amazing about that, but you just want to make sure that they have some system for keeping track of paper, because anybody working with them is going to need to see that stuff. Trust your instincts. Parents do know best. If they suspect that there's a problem, if they feel like something isn't right, most of the time they're absolutely right about it. Validate and encourage parents to trust their gut, and the same goes for you. If you get the feeling that something's really going on in school here, run with it and follow up on it, because it could make the difference between helping this kid or not.
And I think so often this is like the most important thing, because I think that when you go to well checkups, they're very brief, and there's not a lot of time to get into detail, and it's really easy. I know from personal experience dealing with my own children that it's really easy to write something off that should have been a flag. That if you just say, oh, they're just a boy, or oh, they're just doing this, or oh, that's probably just, don't just negate things. Really talk about them. Try to understand what's going on with this kid, because the earlier you catch things, the better off that child and family will be.
Yeah, the other side of that, that coin is it's never too late. There isn't a parent that comes to us that doesn't wish that they hadn't talked to us, years and years before. It doesn't matter.
Little kids.
Yeah, even kids that are like, 3 years old. Parents, I wish we had, done this the year before. Or if the kid is 23 years old. It's never too late. We always validate the parents and say, it's great that you're starting this now. It's great that you're doing this now. There is hope, and there are ways to help at this point. Not too late. Knowing your rights. It's very important that parents get educated about their rights by someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Parents will often rely on other parents or on the internet and will get very confused. And certainly not to rely on the district to educate you on your rights, because often they don't know either. And finally, when it comes to meetings, going to meetings at school, don't go it alone. If parents know that they have to go to a meeting, encourage them to bring a friend, a partner, a spouse, an advocate, somebody else. It's very, very difficult to be the parent and the advocate at the same time at a meeting. So always encourage parents to partner up with somebody for things like that. Okay, so I think, so finally, last slide is some resources for you if you want to explore more on this. We have included our information, Wendy's information, but also COPA is actually the national organization for parent attorneys and advocates, and they have a wonderful website with all sorts of very reliable, free information about special education law.
And where to find help if parents need it.
Right. There's even there's a directory there, so even parents who are moving to another state or not in Pennsylvania or in Pennsylvania, it has a directory of advocates and attorneys and therapists and all kinds of good people there. So that's a safe website to use that parents can trust. Okay. And with that, I think we open it up to questions now.
Yeah.
Fire away.
Yes. Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, please hit #6 to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. If you don't want to use the telephone, you can certainly feel free to type into the Q&A box as well.
And if nobody asks a question, then I can ask some questions of ourselves. But what do we have here? Do we have someone asking a question?
So it looks like, what does that say?
Okay, I see a question here. I'm just trying to read it.
What about
Private. So it looks like the question's revolving around parochial schools and or private schools in another state.
Great question. So these two federal laws apply only to public schools, public charter schools. That's it. Well, let me be more specific. IEPs, IDEA, only applies to public schools and public charter schools. Section 504 sometimes applies to private schools if that private school receives federal funding. So if any institution that receives federal funding would have to comply with Section 504. But IEPs only public schools, and that only goes up through high school. There's no such thing as an IEP for college, even if it's a public college. Kids in college would have rights and protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act and under Section 504. But IEPs, only public schools, and only until the kid graduates or turns 21. Or I should say the school year, they're eligible for an IEP up through the school year in which they turn 21. So a kid with an IEP can stay in high school until they're 21. Well, if they turn 21 in the middle of the year, they get to finish out that year. So no for parochial schools and no for private schools unless they receive federal funding, in which case they would be eligible for protection under 504 only. Does that answer your question?
It sounded good, Josh. Thank you. Looks like there's another question regarding dual enrollment. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Let me grab this one.
Go ahead.
Dual enrollment is means that in Pennsylvania, and this varies from state to state, so I'm only talking about Pennsylvania here, you are allowed to enroll your child in private school or parochial school for whatever reason you want. And if your child wouldn't have been eligible for an IEP had you stayed in the district, you are eligible to receive what's called related services from the school district, even though your child is enrolled in a private school. What that means is a child who would have been eligible for an IEP had they stayed in the district, if you decide you want to send them to Catholic school, you can do that, and you could receive speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy. Those are called related services. There's some other therapies as well. You could receive that from the district. However, there's a big however here. The law is absolutely terrible on this, and what it basically says is the school district, the public school district, only has to make those services available to kids. It doesn't have to do anything to bring them to the kids. So if the district wants to say anybody who wants occupational therapy has to come at 2 o'clock on Tuesdays, they can do that. And if your kid is going to parochial school, 45 minutes away, they would have to come back to the district, at 2 o'clock on Tuesdays to receive their half hour of speech therapy. It's not a very helpful thing. So dual enrollment, as it were, is, in a practical sense, doesn't help kids with special needs as much as we would like it to.
And some districts do a better job.
Yes, some districts, they can voluntarily, if they want, they can contract out with the intermediate units, or they can contract out with other providers to bring related services out to certain private schools, but it's completely up to them whether they're going to do that or not.
But I also just want to say, for those of you that are pediatricians or PAs or nurse practitioners, you can also write a prescription for those families to get OT or speech and language therapy or physical therapy, and they can use their health insurance to get those services. So if it is inconvenient and it's 2 o'clock on Tuesdays for occupational therapy through the school district, you can also write prescriptions for those services so that the families can still receive them.
Right, and I guess the other thing is, and this is very, very important, you might have a family that's paying for their kid to go to private school because that family doesn't think that the public school district can meet their kid's special needs. One of the things that we do most often here is advising parents about whether the school district should be footing the bill for that private school. Because if the kid would have been eligible for an IEP in the district, there are some circumstances under which that district would be required to pay for the private school placement of the kid. That's a complicated thing to sort out, so what I would ask you to do, and for your client's benefit, is if they're sending their kid to private school, you should ask them, are you paying out of pocket for that? Did you talk to the school district about paying for that placement? Most likely they'll say no, or they'll say yes, we asked, but they said no. But only a very experienced special education attorney or advocate could advise a client about whether they could in fact get money from the school district to pay for that placement.
And COPA can help with that.
Yeah, exactly. So that covered more than just the dual enrollment question, but.
Okay, thank you, Josh. It looks like the next question is from Dr. Kumar, and they're asking, if we can, on behalf of a student, whom should we talk to in the school? So this is a provider asking, who would they talk to?
Oh, I would say if there's an issue, and even when I did general peds and not developmental peds, you can always call the teacher directly to get some information about what's happening in the classroom. And if you're doing more of advocating, then you probably want to talk to somebody more administrative, like the principal or the vice principal. But if you're just trying to get information about what's happening, a lot of teachers really appreciate you reaching out. And sometimes I have found that it's easier for the teachers to speak frankly to me than it is for them to speak frankly to a parent, for whatever reason.
The other thing is that if a student has an IEP, then they will have what is called an IEP team, and that team is supposed to include the teachers and the guidance counselor or the psychologist or the special education director, maybe the principal, and certainly the parents, and you. If you want to participate in an IEP meeting and the parent wants you there or wants you on the phone, you are allowed to do that. So lots of doctors will even conference call into an IEP meeting to share their perspective or just to learn what's going on. And you absolutely have the parent has the right to have you participate in that meeting if she wants.
Yeah, a lot of times for patients that I have that might have ADHD that I'm using medications for, the teachers are much more likely to see the kids on medications than, because it's 5 school days and 2 weekend days. So sometimes a phone call to the teacher for more information about that is really helpful.
Okay, great, thank you. And then from Robin, we have, where can we get more information on the BEP plan, on the positive behavior support plan?
Oh, on the positive behavior support plans? Oh, okay. Well, we actually have everything on our website about it.
Right, but the important thing to know is that just like we said, you can request an evaluation from the district, the same thing with the behavior. If there's any behaviors of concern, any, parents are seeing something, teachers are seeing something, they might not necessarily refer that for out to get an evaluation, but parents can request one. Parents can say, I'm concerned about this behavior. What the district often will do is something called an FBA, which stands for Functional Behavior Assessment. So it's someone that comes in and collects data in the school setting across structured and unstructured environments, across multiple days, and collects information from parents, from teachers, from any outside providers, including doctors. And then, like I was saying before, looks for those antecedents, look for the behaviors and then the consequences, what's occurring after the behaviors. We call that the ABCs of behaviors, antecedents, behaviors, consequences. They'll look at and collect all that information and all that data, and then they'll meet as a team and say, this is what we're seeing. Even if sometimes behavior seems random, it's not. There's usually an underlying reason, and it usually follows some sort of pattern. So what is occurring, and then the team needs to discuss it and then to develop the plan. So that is, if there's any sort of concern, it's the same thing you do with requesting an evaluation. You put something in writing, parents put in writing, and request that we take a look at this behavior of concern.
I just also want to note that it's important to look at the antecedent, like what happened before, but it is really important to look at the consequence, because sometimes what will happen is a kid will be approached with a task that is hard for them. They don't want to look stupid. They will do something disruptive, and then they're frequently asked to leave the classroom. So what then the teacher has just done is sort of reward that behavior with enabling the child to avoid a task that's difficult for them. And that sort of reinforces the behavior. So an FBA, or requesting a functional behavioral assessment, is very helpful in understanding what function that behavior serves for the child. And it sort of illustrates that you want a behavioral plan to be positive. You don't always want it to be punitive, because also what you might see as punitive is sort of like a win for the kid, is sort of not what you
Right, but it contributes to that. I mean, the students end up feeling low self-esteem, more anxiety, more avoidance behaviors when it's negatively reinforced, or positive punishment, I should say. But it needs to be a positive intervention or consequence, and then we also need to put antecedent strategies in place to support that behavior. So if we know something's difficult for that child because we've uncovered that through the FBA, then what are we doing before we give that difficult task to that child? How are we helping them ahead of time so that that task is not difficult, so they don't want to avoid it? So the onus is on the professionals, on the teachers. The onus is not on the student to correct or manage the behavior. We need to be helping the kids.
Okay, and so we had one final question, and then I think just one comment. So I think the one comment was that approved private schools, in that situation, the IEPs are at play. Is that correct?
Correct.
Well, wait a minute. It's a little, that's yes and no, okay? So approved, sorry, I'm a lawyer here. I can never answer the question with just a straight yes or no. The thing about approved private schools is this. There's a list that the state maintains of what are called approved private schools. When a student has an IEP in their public school district and the district feels that they can't meet that kid's needs in the public school, they have to pay for it to happen somewhere else. And if the school is going to place the kid in a private school and actually do that through the student's IEP, then they have to do that in one of the approved private schools, because those are the only private schools that will allow a school district to implement an IEP in their school. So the approved private school, take a school like Pathways or something like that. They're an approved private school, so they have to allow the district to remain involved. The district will continue to go to IEP meetings. They will be responsible for making sure that the kid is receiving an appropriate placement, appropriate services. They will be responsible for the kid's education. So the IDEA, the IEP, doesn't actually bind that private school to anything. It's still the district that's responsible for everything. The district is just having the services delivered in the private school. So yes, the IEP goes with the student to that approved private school under those situations, but the law doesn't apply to that private school. It's applying to the district. The district is responsible, not the private school. When the private school is not an approved private school, it means that they're not going to allow the district to remain involved. It can't be done through an IEP, and there's no IEP at all, and that law simply doesn't apply. So to answer the question succinctly, when the kid is placed through their IEP at an approved private school, they still have all of their rights under the law, but it's the district that's responsible for those rights, not the private school.
Great, thank you. And then our last question was regarding a provider who writes a prescription for a family to go seek a related service. To whom should the parent bring that prescription to at the school?
Well, if the student already has an IEP, then I would say there's one person on the IEP team who is designated as the LEA, Local Educational Agency. If the family looks on the IEP in the back, there'll be like a list of who's on the IEP team, and it'll say one of those people will be the Local Educational Agency, the LEA. I would say send it to that person because they're supposed to be sort of in charge of the whole thing, but they could also send it to the principal or the school psychologist or anything of that sort.
But if it's in an IEP, you often don't need a prescription from a medical provider. Getting a prescription from a medical provider is if you want the child to get related services outside of school, or if they're in a private school and they can't get them through the public school conveniently, you can write them a prescription, and then they take it to a provider. And the parents want to probably look at their insurance and see what providers are covered by their health care insurance.
That's a very good point. If the student needs the related service in order to meet their IEP objectives, then the school has to provide those services for free, and they can't require the parent to use their insurance. That free and appropriate public education that you get with an IEP, the F is for free. It means it can't be at any cost to the parents. So the school districts will provide those related services in school.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for all this wonderful information. Everyone, on the last slide that we have presented for you, we have the link for CME and CEU credits for this particular webinar. And we also have on that last slide some upcoming events that we have coming through the Pennsylvania Medical Home Initiative. And the first one is going to be on September 28th. And that is our TIPS webinar, and that's actually a Let's Talk, so that's open to the entire Pennsylvania chapter of the American Academy of Peds. And we strongly recommend that at least one person from each practice try to listen in on that webinar. Since this is a brand new program from the Department of Human Services, and it's the TIPS program is Pennsylvania's telephonic psychiatric consultation services program. And, so what is that? TIPS is a new Pennsylvania Health Choices program designed to increase the availability of child psychiatry consultation teams regionally and telephonically to primary care providers and other prescribers of psychotropic medications for children insured by Pennsylvania's Medical Assistance Program. The program provides real-time peer-to-peer resources to the PCP who desire immediate consultative advice for children up to age 21 with behavioral health concerns. So the core services from TIPS is telephone and face-to-face consultation, care coordination, training, and education. So we're very excited for this Let's Talk webinar. And then we also have, besides the link to register for that, we also have our link for the Learning Collaboratives that we have coming up in September as well, also in this month. So it's a very busy month for us at Pennsylvania Medical Home. We have the Eastern Learning Collab, which will be, the Western Learning Collab, which will be on Tuesday, September 13th. And you're still invited to register and attend. We would love to have you there, all devoted on behavioral health, on integrated care models. We also have the Eastern Learning Collaborative, which is scheduled for Friday, September 16th. The addresses are there on that slide as well. And please, we would love to see you there at the collab. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.